Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's a couple minutes past time, which for Saginaw, that means we're still 5 minutes ahead of time. But it's not just Saginaw. It's been that way everywhere I've been for my whole adult life. But we've got quite a bit to cover today. First thing I want to do is apologize to you. Y'all thought y'all were through with me last week, didn't you? And join the crowd because I thought I was through with me last week. But apparently there was a little bit of mix-up and there wasn't anybody to teach this week. And so Carlin asked, can you teach one more week at least? I said, sure. Of course, it's kind of like the first place I preached many years ago. They asked me, I was a principal down the road. They said, can you just fill in till we find a preacher? Sure. Well, I filled in for 20 years. And so I don't think I'll make 20 years of teaching this time. I don't think I'll last that long. But anyway, we're going to just look at just one little lesson a day that's been really beneficial to me, and I hope it'll help each and every one of you. Kind of background to this, last Wednesday night, the reason we weren't here, there's a whole group of us that were preachers that we kind of rotated in the Wednesday, and a lot of congregations have visiting preachers every Wednesday night through the summer. And I was on the rotation where several of these congregations where I was, and even after I retired, they asked me to come back, which kind of tells you there's a shortage of preachers, doesn't it? And so I went to Graham last Wednesday night. I love the little congregation called the Loving Highway Congregation. Lots of good friends. Mom and Dad attended there for years before they passed away. And so it's always kind of an old home week when we go back. And I was studying for my message last Wednesday night, and I ran across a passage that I am certain that each of you are very familiar with because it's something that's kind of central to our faith. And so if you have your Bibles or your electronic devices, you may want to turn to 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter. We're going to start out there, kind of introduce this, and then we're going to look at another situation in the Lord's ministry that ties this in, I think brings some valuable lessons to us. 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, beginning in verse 1. Now, the speaker, of course, is whom? The author of 2 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul. Very good. So Paul says this, for we know, notice the certainty, that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Now, what in the world, this kind of ties into our Revelation study, very, very symbolic here. What is Paul saying? What is this earthly tent to which he refers? Our physical bodies, our life in this physical life, this life in which we live right now. And then he says, we have if this house is torn down, what does he mean by that? If we die, if it's destroyed, if it goes under all kinds of tribulation and trials, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Now, again, this ties right into the last few chapters of Revelation that we studied. What's he saying? We're going to win. Very good. We're going to win because, as we called it, the second life, the resurrection, is eternal, and it's where? It's in heaven. It's with God. And so if I were really going to just paraphrase that very first verse, Paul is saying to each of us and saying to his first century audience in the city of Corinth, don't focus on the here and now. Why? Why do we not focus on the material things of life, the secular things of life, the here and now? They're very short-lived. They're not going to last. And there's something a whole lot more important than what's going on in our lives today. Physically and mentally and emotionally, there's something a whole lot more important than that. And that importance is what? It's praising God. It's spiritual. Yeah, it's praising God. And then he goes on, for indeed in this house we groan. Which house is he talking about there? Our physical life, yeah. Longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven. So he acknowledges something. A lot of people, not a lot, but some people have a real tough time. And he's saying, hey, Christians, we're going to suffer. He doesn't gloss it over. He doesn't say if you're a child of God, you're not going to have trials. You're not going to have temptations. He's not saying we're not going to have tough times. He acknowledges here we're going to have tough times in this life. But once again, as we've just said in verses 1 and 2, don't focus here, because even the bad things in this life are going to be what? Temporary. Very good. They're going to be temporary. They're not going to last. And we saw that all the way through the book of Revelation. Now, I don't know about you, but I sometimes forget that. You know, it's kind of like I used to use an illustration a lot of different places, a lot of different times I preached. If you walk out in the morning, particularly all those years that I had a job to get to on Monday morning, and I walk outside and I look and my car's kind of leaning a strange way and it's got a flat tire, what do you focus on? Well, y'all are a whole lot different than I was. All I could focus on was that one flat tire. How many of us would focus on the 3 that had air in them? How many of us would focus on the spare in the trunk? Or focus on the jack in the trunk? We focus on the negative things of life, or I do. I can't say we collectively. I sometimes have a habit of focusing on the few bad things, the negative things, the things that make us groan, as Paul says here. There he goes. He goes down. Let's skip down to verse 6. He's keeps talking about the same thing in the next 2 verses. But verse 6, therefore we always, I kind of wish Paul left that word out. We always are of good courage, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. And then verse 7, you all know it. Every one of us can quote this verbatim. For we walk by what? Faith and not by sight. Now, I hate to confess this. You know, years ago I was very naive. I thought the preacher can't get up and confess he's got a weakness. You just can't do that. Can't do that. I figured out, you know what? Not only do I do that, but it's therapeutic. To say, hey, I've got some flaws. I got some things I need to work on. And this is one of them right here. We walk by faith and not by sight. What's he saying there? What's our faith? We got a home in heaven. We got something a whole lot better that's in front of us. And the only way that we're going to get there is not through our own doing, but it's what? Through the faith in Jesus Christ. That's it. And I thought about that this week, like I say, when I was preparing for my message at Loving Highway in Graham, because it kind of tied into that. You know, I just don't do as good a job of that as I should. And as I was preparing, I kind of thought of a scenario in Jesus' life. You know, Jesus, our example. We follow Jesus. Peter says, knowing that Jesus also suffered, leaving you an example that you should what? Follow in his steps. Well, we're going to look at an example of Jesus here and a negative example, if you will, of his disciples that I hope will help us and help us consider this concept of walking by faith instead of by sight. So if you'll turn back now to Matthew, the 14th chapter. This is in Jesus' ministry, and there's this situation that develops in Jesus' ministry, and I don't call it a story. I don't like to do that, because a story seems to imply what? It could be hypothetical, it could be made up, it could be embellished, but this one we know happens exactly the way that Matthew records it here. The chapter 14 starts out where there's all kinds of trauma in Jesus and his disciples' life. And if you're familiar with this, Jesus finds out that a very, very close friend and kinfolk has just been executed. Who was it? John. John the evangelist, John the baptizer, John the Baptist, whatever terminology you want to put. John has been executed. Now, I've never had a friend or a relative who was executed, but I can imagine. Now, some of the relatives probably need to be, I'll put it that way. But the bottom line is I haven't ever had that happen, so I don't understand that trauma. But it obviously was very, very traumatic and very difficult, because Jesus gets it says his disciples, we're assuming just the 12 apostles, and they leave to go to, quote unquote, a secluded place where Jesus can just meditate and pray about the situation. By the way, does anybody know why John was executed? Yeah. Exactly. The king, the Jewish king, we've talked about how the Romans had, puppets for the local rulers that ran it the way they wanted to. And this is one of the Herods. There were four kings of Israel named Herod. This one's named Herod Antipas. And Herod stole his brother's wife. And this woman's name is Herodias. He stole Herodias, and John went and confronted him about it. You're the king. You're supposed to be leading the Jewish people, God's people, and here you've done this horrible, horrible thing. Well, Herod Antipas wanted to execute him, but he just didn't have the backbone to do it, because he knew there were people that were flocking to John and listening to the forerunner of Christ and the story about the Messiah, and he was afraid of the people. But Herodias, she cooked up a scheme where she's going to put him in a predicament where he couldn't do anything about it but do what she wanted. She was just as mad, maybe madder than he was. He wanted him executed. And her daughter danced for a gathering, and publicly before these, he said, you can have anything you want. And she went to her mama and said, what do you want? She said, I want John's head on a platter. Now, think about that barbaric act. But Herod rather, because he had made this promise in front of a group of people, he couldn't back down. And so he did exactly that. Well, again, when Jesus finds this out, he and his disciples leave. And where they went was way, way, way up in the very northern part of Israel. It was a desolate, secluded place. It was up north of the Sea of Galilee. If you're familiar with the geography of that country, Sea of Galilee is a little bitty body of water, and I say little bitty because at its widest point, it's only 8 miles wide, and the longest point is only 13 miles long. But it was so central in Jesus' message and Jesus' ministry, so they went up there into a mountainous region. And Jesus had apparently hoped to get away from the crowds of people that were flocking to him. Now, why were all the people coming to see and hear Jesus? Oh, he's healing people. He's casting out demons. He's performing miracles. A lot of people were getting convinced this is the Messiah. And so people are flocking to him. Now, again, this is kind of desolate country. Now, we know that there are about 30 little villages around the Sea of Galilee, so people apparently came from all of these. And the only major city was Caesarea, which is up there on the western corner of the body of water. And Jesus and his apostles get up there, but very clear, the ploy to get away didn't work, because throngs and throngs and throngs of people flood in to this area north of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus and his apostles had gotten there by coming across the Sea of Galilee. Much easier way to transport than to walk. Well, Jesus all day long performs miracles, heals people, preaches to them, and it gets to be what we'd call supper time. And his apostles, his disciples, come to him and tells him, send all these people away. Why? Send them all away. Get rid of them. We're hungry. Sounds like a man, doesn't it, ladies? We're hungry. And we know, as we read on down here in just a minute, there's a whole lot of folks there. And Jesus says something that had to be just mind-boggling to them. I think about how many statements Jesus makes that just defy human logic. But what was his statement? Remember, what did he tell them? You feed them. You feed them. Now, we read down here in just a few minutes, there's approximately 5,000 men there. And there's 12 of these apostles and one Jesus. 5,000, and then that didn't count the women and children. And I've seen scholars estimate, and that's all, it really is a guesstimate, because they have no way of knowing, because the Bible never says, but they've estimated anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people gathered upon this desolate hillside in northern Israel. You give them something to eat. Now, can you see these guys looking at each other? And they even said, we don't have the wherewithal to do that. And Jesus said, sit them down. We only have 5 loaves and 2 little fish. That's all we have. And I have to believe that they were thinking in the back of their heads, whose supper is that? That's my supper. And scholars of the first century say that when it talks about the loaves of bread, these aren't like the loaves that we think of, that we buy in the grocery store. These are small bricks made of 1 quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley. There wasn't much to them. And 2 fish, we don't know the size of the fish, but it wouldn't matter if they were whales. You couldn't feed that many people. And so he says, have them all sit down. And they did. And he blessed the loaves, and he began to had them, the 12 men themselves, pass it out. And they passed it out, and they passed it out, and they passed it out, and they passed it out. And the NASB, from which I study, it says that they all ate, and they were all satisfied. Now, what does that tell us? They got full. Thousands and thousands of people getting full on 5 little loaves and 2 fish. Now, put yourself in these apostles' place right now. What do you think was going through their head? This is, how could this happen? I've got a feeling they're dumbfounded. They are in awe of this. I'm going to begin reading down in verse 22 where we pick this up. Immediately, he made the disciples get in the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he sent the crowds away. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, and when it was evening, he was there alone. So finally, Jesus gets to do what they set out to do to start with. It's kind of fascinating to me, kind of a side lesson for old Greg. Take care of the people that need it. Before you take care of your own needs, take care of the people that need it. And these people, boy, did they need it. Just like people need it today, just like we need it today. Take care of people's needs. Verse 24, but the boat was already a long distance from the land. Now, the Greek word that's used and translated long distance was mini stadia. Stadia was a Roman measurement that was very prevalent in the first century. A stadia was about 600 feet, or 1/8 of a mile. About 1/8 of a mile. And it's many stadia. We don't know how many. We know it, I'm just, this is speculative. I'm thinking out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Maybe several miles out in the middle of the sea, too far to swim. And then we know what happens next. It talks about, it says, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. You know, when I was a little boy, my grandmother, if you were doing something that bothered her, she would say, don't be contrary. Now, I never heard that, but my little sister heard it all the time. And if you believe that, stand on your head in the corner over there. Now, Granny would say, Greg, or it was always Gregory Allen. And that's when I knew she was serious. Gregory Allen, don't be contrary. What contrary mean, or contrary, as we would correctly pronounce it? Difficult, almost overwhelming. And so this talks about this wind, and it says it battered the boat. Now this again is where a little bit of geographic knowledge of this part of the world comes into effect. The Sea of Galilee, like I said, it's not very big, but it's down in a hole. In fact, it's the lowest sea level of any lake in the world. and it's surrounded by desert, and desert is mountains. And the meteorologists say that it is a perfect storm, metaphorically speaking, that these winds come off the desert, and they come down these desert mountains, and they accelerate, and gale force, even hurricane force winds are not uncommon on the Sea of Galilee. And this is hard for me to visualize, being a West Texas boy. Said the waves on this are not uncommon at 20 feet. And sometimes even some have been measured at 30 feet. Now, can you imagine being a little rickety fishing boat with waves that are 20 to 30 feet high? And that's what I'm envisioning here. I've been in a bass boat when we had a pretty good little thunderstorm came up, but nothing like 30-foot waves. So they're here in this predicament, if you will. And in the fourth watch of the night, anybody know when that was? I'm sorry? Just before dawn. Very good. It again was the Roman time, and the Roman time and the Jewish time didn't always concur, but this Matthew gives in the Jewish time. The fourth watch of the night, as he said, was right before dawn. It's between 3 and 6 a.m. So somewhere in here, between 3 and 6 a.m., this horrible windstorm is going in. And these guys, you know, they're terrified. Even Matthew, or rather Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they probably may have been even more frightened than the others. Why? They were fishermen on this very lake when Jesus called them. They knew what this storm could do. So it's pitch black, the wind is howling, and make things even more terrifying. And in the fourth watch of the night, he, referring to Jesus, came to them walking on the sea. Now, I got to confess, I used to be pretty tough on old Peter right here, and the other apostles. I used to be pretty tough on them. Metaphorically speaking, I used to throw rocks at them here. Because they look out there and they declare, what? It's a ghost. Put yourself in that boat with 30-foot waves and howling wind and pitch black, and you look out there and you see this specter walking on the water. And then see if you can still be very critical of the apostles. What else could it be? It can't be a person. It can't be human. It can't be Jesus. We left him back up there at Caesarea on the mountainside. So they look out there, and it says they were terrified, and they cried out, it's a ghost, and they cried out in fear. I'm sure that's an understatement. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Now that's the second really illogical, if I use that word, not saying it against Jesus, but from a human point of view, illogical statement Jesus made. He told them to feed thousands of people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and now he tells them in the middle of this storm and the waves and this ghost, as they think it is, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And keep back to what we talked about a minute ago in 2 Corinthians 5th chapter, verse 7, walk by faith and not by sight. I think it's the object lesson right here. And then, like I say, in the past, I've been pretty tough on Peter and the other apostles, and I really have always come down on Peter right here. Peter said to him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Lord, you say that's you. If it's true to you, I can walk on the water too, if that's your will. Now again, I don't know about anybody else in this assembly this morning. Old Greg is not going to step out of the side of that boat and try to walk on the water in a raging storm. I have to confess, I'm not going to do it. And Peter, we charge him of being very impetuous, and I guess he is so often. But here, I see a great act of faith right here. I see faith in action. He steps out over the side of that boat. He got out and he said, come. And Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and came. Now here's I think a key word right here in this verse. Toward Jesus. Toward Jesus. Now, we think about the environment. We think about the raging storm. We think about the waves 30 feet high or 20 feet high or however high they are. And the foam spray and the waves breaking over the bow of the boat. So for Peter to walk, this is common sense, for Peter to walk toward Jesus, what's he got to do? I'm sorry? He's got to be focused on Jesus. Very good, Mary. He's got to focus on. There's no way he could have walked to him in this raging storm if he hadn't been focused on him, zeroed in on him, honed in on him, whatever term you want to use, and walked toward Jesus. Now that's the first part of a very, very valuable lesson for old Greg. When you got troubles and difficulties, don't pay attention to the difficulties and trouble. Focus on Jesus. Because we see in the very next verse there what happens when you don't. Verse 30, but seeing the wind. All of a sudden, he didn't see Jesus anymore. He saw what? He saw the wind and the storm. And sometimes, again, speaking metaphorically, when I have storms in my life, I focus on the storm. I focus on the negative. I focus, like I said, on that one flat tire, and that's all I look at. And you know, there may be other storms that are raging at the same time, but if we focus on the storm, we can't focus on whom? Jesus. And that's what we just talked about in 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, verse 7. That's faith. That's faith. Jesus will get me out of the storm. I quit focusing on him. I don't have that assurance anymore. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and he began to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. He began to sink. Don't raise your hand here. Anybody ever sunk? I'll raise my hand. I've sometimes caught myself sinking. Either emotionally, sometimes physically. I get frustrated because I'm focusing on the storm. And Peter began to sink. Now again, we can be pretty tough on old Peter here, but when he realized he was sinking, suddenly, where did his focus return? Back to Jesus, because he said what to Jesus? Help me. Help me. So he's focused on Jesus. He's walking on the water. He focuses on the storm. He begins to sink. He focuses on Jesus, and he's saved, because we read here. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, now I think this is a point I had missed for years and years and years. You of little faith, why did you doubt? I wonder how often Greg resembles that remark right there. You know, if I were to ask, I have no doubts about this, so again, I'm not going to ask you to publicly respond, but if I were to ask this group of folks here on this Lord's Day morning in Saginaw, how many of us have faith? How many hands do you think could go up? Everybody, right? Is there anybody in here that would say, I don't have any faith? I would say, I do. I believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I believe that he came to this earth. I believe that he bled and he died on the cross of Calvary. I believe he was resurrected the third day. And I believe that my sins are washed away by being immersed in that watery grave. I believe all that. There is no doubt in my mind. I believe that the Lord created the heavens and the earth. I believe that this Holy Spirit has come, and I have that because of my baptism. I believe all those things. But every time I get all torn up and worry about something, or all torn up and stressed about my predicament, whatever it may be, what have I just non-verbally said? I don't have enough faith for the Lord to take care of me. And sometimes, I hate to admit, but sometimes that's me. And when he said, he didn't say, Peter, oh, you of no faith. He didn't say that. He said what? Little faith. And again, I see me there right pretty often. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And then verse 33, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, you are certainly God's Son. Now again, I don't think there's any doubt that anybody in this assembly this morning would say, I know that Jesus is God's Son. I know he's the key to my salvation. I know that, we talk about God being omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. I believe all that. But then sometimes I'm like Peter. I have faith, but sometimes it's just not enough. You remember the ruler that came and asked Jesus to heal his demonic son? And he said, heal him. And he said, okay. And the man said, he asked Jesus, or Jesus asked him, do you believe? I.e., do you have faith? And the ruler's response was what? I believe, but help my unbelief. And I catch myself praying that pretty often, Lord, my faith's not where it ought to be. And that's what I see over there in 2 Corinthians 5:7, where he said, we walk by faith and not by sight. And verse 1, where he said, we're always of good courage. That's my daily prayer. Lord, help me be able to see that. Help me be able to say, Lord, I'm always walking by faith and not walking by sight. Now, this is another point that I thought about while I prepared my lesson the other night for Graham. Is this the first time these men had ever seen anything like that? No. When this same scenario take place? You go back 6 chapters in Matthew, the 8th chapter. The only way we can really distinguish the difference, Jesus wasn't out walking on the water in that one. Where was Jesus? He was asleep in the boat. And we've even got a song we used to sing all the time when I was a kid growing up in worship. Carest thou not that we perish? Kind of took the old King James. Carest thou not that we perish? How canst thou lie asleep? While each moment the wind billows are waving, threatening a grave in the angry deep. They had seen that. We don't know exactly how long that was before, but it hadn't been very long. They saw that. Think about that. They saw that. And then they saw thousands of people be fed by just a meager amount of food. They saw that, and yet they still doubted. Again, that's me. All the things that I have seen in my life that no way in the world could I ever say the Lord's hand wasn't in that was the Lord's will. It all worked out like God wanted it to. No way, after all I've seen, that I should doubt. But I still do. And so I look at this, and like I told the folks the other night, I made reference to the same setting. I said, I don't have any limit on what I need to work on. But this is number one in my life right here. Walk by faith and not by sight. Anybody have any comments? We really finished early this morning. But that's all right, because like I said, I chalk it up. I have a clock in the back of my head, so the next time I speak, I know I have 10 minutes extra. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, Mary. Yep. Excellent. Good. And like I say, in this simple scenario right here, there have been times where, boy, I've really come down hard on the apostles, really come down hard on Peter. And like I said, I saw what they saw on that storm-tossed sea, and sitting there where Peter is, I'm not going to get out of the boat. And so it makes me a whole lot more empathetic, I guess, with their... And right now, I'm just going to be honest with you since we've got a few minutes. This is next, let's see, today's the 25th, is that right? 26th, okay. Tuesday, the 28th, is the 11th, I hate to use the word anniversary, of that pretty significant stroke that I had 11 years ago. And I will be the first to confess, man, I had quite a few pity parties right after that happened. I mean, the most downtrodden I was in my whole life. I was in ICU. It was a closed ICU on Saturday night after I'd had the stroke on Wednesday. I'm laying there in that ICU bed with IVs in both arms and a blood pressure cuff that goes off every 15 minutes, and woke me up, and they had an alarm on it if it was too high, and then you got worried, and the next time it went off, it was even more anxiety. And to make it really bad, it was a closed ICU. DN couldn't be up there. I was in there by myself, and the nurses, apparently one of them, was having a birthday party out in the hall. And I'm laying there, terribly uncomfortable, and the ER doctor had just come in that very morning, and I was griping about being there. I could say I could be laying at home and wouldn't have. He said no, and he told me, and I quote, "If you have another stroke and you're at home, you're going to die, and you're right on the verge of having another stroke. And if you're here, we might can save you." So I've got that running through my head. And I am sitting there, like I say, I'm having a pity party for old Greg. I mean, the athlete his whole life, Mr. I can do anything I want to do, 10-foot tall, bulletproof, and I can't even get out of bed. And I'm laying there, and I'm thinking about that. And then it hit me. It hit me. You know what? Even if that happened, think what's ahead. Think what's ahead. That stroke was probably the best thing that ever happened to me spiritually. Now, it sure wasn't the best thing that ever happened to me physically, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me spiritually, because it kind of got my priorities straightened out. And I still gripe, moan, and whine about limping around and the weakness in my left side and all that kind of stuff. But based on what we just said in 2 Corinthians 5th chapter, Paul says, that's not going to last. None of these negatives are going to last. There's something a whole lot better ahead of you. And so, like I say, I can really, really benefit from going back and looking at this, because it does tell me, look beyond the physical. Walk by faith and not by sight. Mary, that's a great comment. Anything else? Well, I just flittered away for my 10 minutes. So, 6, yeah, I got 6 minutes. Kathy, you can be my official timekeeper. I don't know. I have no idea who's going to be teaching next week. It may be me. I don't know. But anyway, thank y'all very much for your attention this morning. Great to see you as always. And like I say, I feel like I misled you last week when I told you I was through.